I got asked the other day, what is the biggest problem in America? And I thought about it. I hadn't been asked that question. Lately, I've been getting some good questions. A lot of times, like you, I get the same questions over and over and over again. But I got asked, what's the biggest problem in America? And I thought about it for a second, and this may or may not be right. But I thought it was at least thought-provoking. I said that the biggest problem that we have in America is that we don't have any big problems. And if you look at us in World War II, during the Depression, during times where we've got major problems, the country kind of unifies and it gets behind itself and joins together. And, I talked about, that we live in a bubble here. I kind of opened up with that as well. And that's good. Like I want there to be a bubble, just like I want my family to live in a bubble. And I almost want my daughter to really think it's a real problem that there's not a strong Wi-Fi signal in her bedroom. And so sometimes it takes longer to I've kind of succeeded as a dad. If that's her problem, if she sees that as a problem, that it takes a little extra. There's a longer buffering time on some of her Netflix, right? I've done a good job if that's a problem, because God can only imagine what kind of problems people really have. But sometimes I feel like in America and really in the West as a whole, the problem is that we don't have any major problems. So now it's the Wi-Fi in our bedroom that we're getting crazy about and wanting to lash out about. And I guess my point here is that do we as individuals, do we need struggle there to keep us focused on the right things? And as a country or as a culture, do we need to have some level of struggle before we start looking at things that don't matter and turning them into things that we perceive as actually mattering?
Yeah, well, a couple of things about that. Kierkegaard wrote about that back in the late 1850s, thereabouts. And he said there will come a time when the best thing that you could do for people would be to make things more difficult. Right, and that's a thing, because everyone's working so hard on making things easier. There'll come a time when there's a felt sense for difficulty, and I think we're at that point now. And I think that's why this message of responsibility and truth is echoing so nicely particularly among young men. Because every time I talk about that in my public talks, the room goes silent, and that's really interesting. And people are dead focused on it. And so, like, enough rights and freedom. It's like truth and time for truth and responsibility. And there's something noble about that. And we haven't been able to talk about nobility for God only knows how long, So I do think that's the case. And I think and William James said that what we need is a moral equivalent to war. So something that's as serious, but that is hopefully not as destructive. And so I really like that idea as well. And so, but I think that we are at that point if people would open their eyes a little bit, because we have this unbelievable culture, this technological culture that does provide the degree of protection that you described. That's an ongoing miracle, right? It's absolutely unbelievable that any of this works at all. And it could easily not work, and if it didn't work, there would be hell to pay. And to keep it working and to keep it moving forward, especially with what's going to come over the next 10 years, with artificial intelligence and the sorts of things that we're learning and inventing, we better have our acts together. And so I think that you can get that warlike sense if you start to understand that you can take on your life like that. That's also why I think it's so necessary to see the world as a battleground in some sense between good and evil. But you don't put the evil outside. Like, some of it's outside, obviously, but that's not your initial concern. Your initial concern is to get your act together. Right? To take on the burden of being, to bear the suffering. Like you said, you found that when you went out into combat that, you might have been wary of death, which is perfectly reasonable, but that you weren't afraid of it to the point where it would paralyze you. Well, that's a useful thing to know, because it means that you're different than you thought you were, because people are afraid of suffering and death, and especially if they've been completely and constantly sheltered from it. But you can discover, and lots of people do, that if they actually confront it, that they can tolerate it far better than they thought. I mean, think about all the people who work in like palliative care wards, you know, or in funeral parlors for that matter. Like they're confronting death on an ongoing basis, and yet every day they go to work. So people are tough. And so I think there is a responsibility that everybody can take up. And I think the responsibility is something like, well, we need to decide if we're going to collectively and individually tilt the world towards heaven or tilt it towards hell. We saw what hell was like in the 20th century. That could be back at our doorstep in no time flat. We should have learned that. And it's necessary for people to understand the relationship between their individual actions and the direction of culture as a whole. You know, look at that guy in Charlottesville. You know, that was one guy. And he probably increased polarization in the United States by like 5% or something, you know. It doesn't take very many individual actions of that pathological sort to tip things in a very terrible direction. So, I mean, one of the things I've been telling the people who've been watching my videos and in the live conversations is that you have to take yourself seriously. You have to know that you're a monster and that you're capable of terrible things, and that you have a responsibility to understand that, to incorporate it, to constrain it, and to discipline it, and then to work for the alleviation of suffering and the constraint of malevolence. And if you understand that, then it can turn your life into a noble enterprise. And then you have some self-respect, which beats the hell out of self-esteem in my estimation. So, and I don't think that that's a difficult message for people to understand. I think they know that at a fundamental level, and I think at the moment they're starving to death for it.